Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll try to keep the spirit of the political rally going. And Fred will certainly do that. I had planned to give a speech, short but a speech, and I would talk about my family, and I must say two of them have already been introduced. Mary's my daughter-in-law, and Edwin's my stepson. No, I'm not going to do that. And I was going to talk about Chicago, cultural Chicago I'm very much involved in, about this, I believe, is our golden age. I think our children or grandchildren will look back at the early part of the 21st century and said, Chicago has never been so wonderful. It took such a giant leap in the estimation of people all around the world. I travel a lot, and particularly for the international art world. It used to be, they'd say, oh, you're from Chicago, and they go, ah. And then later on it became the Michael Jordan years, and they do this. Now they just say, it's a beautiful city. It's a wonderful city. Well, I won't do that because Fred Siegel is such an amazing guy, and you were in for such a treat in terms of the things he knows and the provocative way he will talk about them, that I just want to spend a few minutes about him and then let him take all the time. And he would particularly like to do a lot of Q&A, and I know everybody, at least several people at our table, are raring to meet that challenge. I got to know Fred when he was, he incidentally has some Chicago roots and a lot of Chicago family, when he was involved with the Progressive Policy Institute, which is a moderate, a Democratic one. But he also writes for the Weekly Standard, his columns in the Wall Street Journal frequently, and a number of other things. And he wrote a book, or an earlier book, before the Giuliani Prince in the City, called The Future Once Happened Here. You get that title, The Future Once Happened Here, New York, D.C., L.A., and the Fate of America's Big City. It was described by Peter Jennings as one of the most important books of the year when it came out. Fred is a remarkable person who is quite provocative, and as I said, ideas about. I want to give you one line in one of his columns in the Wall Street Journal, which I think sets the tone of the kind of guy he is. He once described Rudy Giuliani in this column in the Journal as it isn't that Giuliani is a great mayor in spite of the fact that he's impossible. It's that Giuliani is a great mayor because he is impossible. And I think that sums up Giuliani. It also sums up Fred's acute understanding of urban America. There's nobody better. And we were talking about New Orleans, for example. And it is my pleasure to drop the rest of my speech and give you Fred Siegel, and for a long time, I hope.
Thanks, Lou. I'll try to live up to that. I should acknowledge my family here, my ineffable sister-in-law, Joni Rosenfeld, Howard Naft, brother-in-law Howard Naft, my nephew Rob Rosenfeld, and today particularly Lou and Cecil Taman, whose son is the battering practice pitcher for the Chicago White Sox. And from my point of view, this is a very good day. The White Sox won, and Harriet Meyer's nomination was withdrawn. I want to explain indirectly why I think Lou has it right, why this golden age you're having in Chicago now is partly attributable to the older Daley, Richard J. Daley. But to get there, I'm going to go through Giuliani and a guy named John Lindsay. I'm just curious in this room, how many people remember a guy named John Lindsay? Oh my God. This just goes to show people in Chicago are more intelligent than people in Washington. I gave a talk in Washington about a year ago, about 500 people in the room, and I asked how many people heard of John Lindsay. 11 people raised their hands. 10 were from New York. In any case, let me first stipulate how different the two cities are. New York has far fewer homeowners and far more ideologues. New York is a much more ideological city than Chicago. It used to be joked that in the 1930s, New York was the only part of the Soviet Union where open debate was possible. Now, in order to understand why Giuliani is important, you have to understand what he did well before 9/11. And here I'm not referring to terrorism. He prepared New York for a terrorist attack beginning in the 1990s, despite the opposition of the New York Times and many others who were convinced he was paranoid. I'm talking about the city he inherited in 1994. When he takes over, New York is literally bankrupt in every sense of the word. It can't pay its bills. Half the adult population wants to leave. And just a few anecdotes to give you some sense of the situation. Central Park, public space. Central Park is our most important public space. Public spaces are important. I've been to your Millennium Park. It's fantastic. The Parks Commissioner at the time, 1993, during the administration of David Dinkins, who was John Lindsay's heir. David Dinkins, Parks Commissioner, is standing in Central Park, and she's talking about what's going on in the park. The cameras are rolling, and as she's speaking, a dead body bobs to the surface of the Central Park Lake. It's true. It's true. When Mayor Dinkins is interviewed by a local reporter who says that she's been driven out of town because of aggressive panhandling, his response was, "Sorry you left. Sorry further that I can't tax you anymore." I can't make that up. In the Dinkins years, the city lost 230,000 jobs. 1/4 of all the jobs lost in the United States in the early 1990s recession. It didn't even make a political ripple because they were private sector jobs. New York City was, and to some extent still is, even after Giuliani, a city run by its public sector unions. Now, there may be people here from public sector unions who want to argue with me, and I'd be glad to argue with them. Public sector unions run New York. They run it into bankruptcy repeatedly. We will be near bankruptcy again in another 2 or 3 years. While other cities have occasional bouts with bankruptcy, we have one about once a decade. So Giuliani takes the city over, and there's a sense that New York is literally ungovernable, that crime is out of control, and that fear is everywhere. We had 2 riots in the Dinkins years. One where Mayor Dinkins, in his infinite Lindsay-like wisdom, sided with a drug dealer against the cop. Another, which was really a pogrom that went on for 3 days, and Dinkins wouldn't allow the police to intervene. What Giuliani does is he takes on the interest groups, and it's hard to grasp Giuliani's intelligence. His personality is so operatic that you miss how thoughtful he is, how bright he is. I ran seminars for him for 2 years, and I remember one day in particular, we're going over the city charter in detail. And as I'm going over it with him, I realized he knows the city charter better than I do. What am I doing here? All he was looking for is the little wrinkle, the little curl at the end of a line which says you can do this as opposed to that. He had lost in '89 against Dinkins. He spent 4 years preparing to govern. My suspicion is he's studying the federal government right now in great detail. But the key to understanding Giuliani is to see that he's the guy who undid what John Lindsay did to New York in the 1960s. In the 1960s, John Lindsay was the great hope, the great liberal hope. He was on the cover of all the news magazines. He was talked about as a president. And he was always compared favorably to one person, Richard J. Daley. And the argument, if you read the New York Times or Newsweek or any of the mainstream media, was Daley was a thug, a failure. Giuliani was the bright hope for the future. And if you think I'm exaggerating, you've all got LexisNexis these days. Just go back and look. Lindsay very nearly destroyed New York. In the middle of the greatest economic boom in American history, he intentionally doubled the welfare rolls. I talk about this in the earlier book, The Future Once Happened Here. Intentionally. And if you think that's an exaggeration, in that earlier book I reproduced some of the ads where the city advertises for people to come on to welfare. This is at a time when the newspapers are filled with help wanted ads. What that did was shunt a huge population of people into marginality, cut off from the workforce, cut off from the larger society. Lindsay had the notion, which was absolutely correct, that we had a serious obligation to those people, those African Americans who've been seriously disadvantaged by American history, by American racism. He was right about that. The way he went about it was disastrous. Doubling the welfare rolls, destroying the public school system. To get a sense of this question, go back to this question of public space, Central Park, Millennium Park, his Parks Commissioner was a foppish aristocrat by the name of August Heckscher. Heckscher actually gave a speech in which he said the following: some people like to use the park benches to sit on, other people like to use them to break them up. That's okay. These are all uses of the parks. This is what you might describe as normlessness. Lindsay despised the middle class. He described them as living in ticky-tacky homes in the outer boroughs. He was only comfortable with people who were so wealthy they didn't need to work, or people so poor that they didn't work. But he was very uncomfortable with the middle class. One of the virtues of Richard J. Daley was he understood the importance of the middle class for any successful city. It's also true of his son. In many ways, Richard J. Daley was the 90s reform mayor ahead of his time. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? In the 1990s, Lou mentioned the Democratic Leadership Council, Progressive Policy Institute that I'm associated with. We're the guys who wrote Clinton's platform in 92. I wrote part of the urban section. 92, I worked for Clinton. 93, I worked for Giuliani. I'm not a partisan. I like competent people who try to solve problems. In any case, Daley's idea of urban housekeeping, of dealing with the basics, making sure the garbage is collected, the streets are attractive, that the city is appealing. That's what drove Daley, and that's what drove the 90s reform mayors. You had Richard M. here, you had Norquist nearby, you had Steve Goldsmith not too far away in Indianapolis, you had Giuliani. There were a whole host of these mayors. Unfortunately, they're no longer around. Those ideas took hold, and I don't think, even though those mayors are gone, I don't think those ideas are going to lose out anytime soon. When Daley looked at John Lindsay, he's once supposed to have said, this is too good to be true, I think, but he's supposed to have said, well, he's not interested in taking out the garbage. Because he was baffled by Lindsay. What's Lindsay up to? Lindsay was going to remake New York, remake the world. He didn't. He took on tasks which were not possible. When you take on tasks that are undoable, it's inherently corrupting. Now, when Giuliani comes in, he gives a famous quality of life speech that sets the tone for his administration. I wrote the speech, and I wrote it with one eye on Chicago in mind. And the reason is because I spent so much time visiting my relatives. And so I spent a lot of time in Chicago looking around, getting the feel of the city. And so I had a sense that, and Richard M. Daley was already putting flower pots up and beautifying the city. And I had a sense this is what we ought to be doing in New York. That if you don't deal with the quality of life, you lose your middle class residents. Now, why did this happen to New York, and why did Chicago avoid some of these problems? Well, it's really fairly straightforward. Political parties and public sector unions draw on the same raw material, city workers. In New York, public sector unions were the first to organize in the country, back as 1958, the Little Wagner Act. When those same public sector unions tried to organize in Chicago, Daley chased them out. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because if you have a political machine, and there are many failings with political machines, you've got a scandal going on now. Political machines have to be responsive to a broad array of people. In New York, the public sector unions, once they displaced the political parties, were the city. In an average New York election, half the people who come out work directly or indirectly for the city. Victor Gottbaum, the head of DC 37, the largest New York City municipal union, who was the guy that Daley kicked out, once said, we can elect our own boss. And that's exactly right. And if they didn't get what they wanted, they brought the city to a screeching halt. Can you imagine Chicago, the union being allowed to dump raw sewage into the lake in order to get more in the way of a contract that was negotiating? Can you imagine the number of police riots we've had in New York? Now, everyone knows that the NYPD is great. Monday night, I was sitting across the table from the CIA bureau chief in New York, and he was talking to me and saying that the NYPD is the best counterterrorism force in the United States, far better than the FBI. I can only tell you this is entirely true. If you want to ask me why, I'll go into the details. But I live in Brooklyn, not far from where two of the 9/11 hijackers stayed before the events. So I don't say this casually. But there were police riots. When the police didn't get what they wanted, they blocked the Brooklyn Bridge, let air out of tires, had wild rallies at City Hall, sanitation workers dumping garbage in the street, teachers going on extended strikes. That's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is this bankrupted New York. When Lindsay came into office, New York was a moderately high tax place. When he left office, we were the highest tax locality in the United States. We still are. In Lindsay's wake, the city lost 570,000 jobs. Didn't make a political ripple. The municipal election that followed was based on the same thing. Who could promise the public sector unions more? Because everyone understood that's where the votes were. Ed Koch was elected and had 2 very good first years because he was the first New York politician to say no to public sector unions. However, then he decided to run for governor, and all was forgotten. In his last 6 years in office, he rehired 50,000 people who'd been laid off in the fiscal crisis of the 70s without improving city services one whit. Giuliani's administration, in some sense, was the heir to the first 2 years of Ed Koch. But where Koch backed down, where Koch was eventually rolled by interest groups, Giuliani couldn't be rolled. Let me describe the situation to you. It's now 1994. Giuliani is asked how many people work for the Board of Education. No one can tell him. No one has any idea how many people work for the Board of Education. So he makes fun of the Board of Education. He calls over to the Catholic schools and asks how many people work for the Catholic schools. And a guy in the room shouts out, how many people work here at the Central Board? And the answer came back, 37. Well, he went on television the next day describing his conversation. People were in a rage. There were demonstrations every day at City Hall. It was a regular carnival. I remember running into the actress Rosie Perez one day. We attract all sorts of celebrities. We attracted all sorts of celebrities at these things. Celebrities is a nice way to put it. She comes up to me and she says, if you cut it, it bleeds. If you cut, she kept repeating this. I had no idea what she was talking about. I assumed she meant cuts in city services. But I couldn't get any more out of her, so I just gave up. Giuliani was unmoved. He could not be rolled. That was the secret of his success. He brings the extraordinary reductions in crime run against all the conventional wisdoms of all my fellow academics. It explained crime is caused by root causes. His police commissioner, Bill Bratton, knew that wasn't true. We understood broken windows policing, which I know you're beginning to do in Chicago, and you're beginning to do CompStat policing. How many people know what broken windows are and CompStat are? For those of you who don't know, just very briefly. Broken window says, take the small things seriously. Richard M. Daley didn't have to be told that. Small things count. If a window's broken and you don't fix it, it says no one's in charge here. I had a very personal connection to this. One of the things Bratton did was arrest people who jumped the turnstiles. We also had token suckers, people who use their mouth to suck out tokens. He began arresting. I once interrupted a guy one day. One day I was going into the I didn't see him. He was down there sucking the token. I nearly trampled him. Anyway, Bratton began arresting people who jumped the turnstiles. It turned out that 1 out of every 7 people who jumped the turnstiles were wanted, had serious felony warrants outstanding. So all of a sudden, by arresting turnstile jumpers, you were reducing the serious crime rate. Well, one day I got a call from a guy who begins, Professor. I knew there's a problem. Nobody calls me professor, except unless they're being sarcastic. It's a local cop. He's arrested my 2 sons for jumping the turnstiles, and he thinks this is hilarious. Fortunately, they have no outstanding felony warrants, and I was able to bring them home. That was the first thing, but that wasn't enough. The second thing was CompStat, which you've begun to institute here. I would point out to you that in Giuliani's last year in office, Chicago, which has 1/3 the population of New York, had more murders. In other words, your murder rate was 3 times higher than ours. This is something that Chicago was learning from New York. Giuliani learned from Richard M. Daley, but Chicago is now learning from New York. And successful cities, that's what they do. They learn from other places. How's it being done somewhere else? What CompStat does is it maps crime on a daily basis. It used to be my office at Cooper Union. Just for those of you who don't know, I teach at Cooper Union. It's a small school in New York. Everyone is on full scholarship. Other than West Point, it's the hardest school to get into in the United States. Everyone's a double 700. But also the bad part of the school is we're right near the East Village, right near the drug trades of Avenue A, B, and C. And I knew whenever there was a tactical narcotics raid at Avenues A, B, and C because the drug dealers were outside my window. My office was on the first floor. And I would watch them break into cars. And you'd hear them talk. They knew that if the cops were over there, no one was over here, and they had free hand. What CompStat began to do is it began to map crime. So when you map crime, you can anticipate where these guys are going. Crime in New York dropped dramatically by 70% with no increase in the prison population. I want you to think about that. In most of the United States where crime has declined, I hope someone asks me a question about the Fakakta book, Freakonomics. In most cases, crime drops, most of the country, crime dropped because of rising imprisonment rates. It didn't drop everywhere. We can get into that. In any case, crime went down because fewer people were committing crimes. Our criminals were showing up in places like Cambridge, Mass., where they discovered it was better territory. You know, get out of New York. It doesn't work anymore. Crime no longer pays. What was CompStat is now done on a minute-by-minute basis. Crimes are reported, they go up, and they're being mapped immediately, and you have a kind of ready response. So what we did was we learned how to police more intelligently. On welfare, Giuliani reduced the welfare rolls, try this, by 600,000 people in his first 4 years. That's bigger than Indianapolis, bigger than Cincinnati, or what's left of Cincinnati. How did he do this? He discovered something back in the Koch years, that if you ask people on welfare to collect their checks in person, a lot of people were working. Turned out a lot of people in Newark were getting welfare in New York City. So all of a sudden, the welfare rolls began to drop dramatically. And then what happens is, you have the same amount of money coming into the welfare program. You use that money to help the people who remain get jobs, to improve themselves. This was a kind of win-win situation. But those interests that were aligned with government, social service agencies, the voluntary agencies that live off government, were immensely hostile to this. He was never moved. And the reason he wasn't moved, the city was broke. This is before national welfare reform. There were 1.1 million people in New York on welfare. We simply couldn't afford it. Now, the important thing to note here is all this occurred before the economy turns up. In New York, we go into recessions earlier, we come out later. You have much shorter recessions than we do. Because of our public sector spending cycle, we went into the 92 recession in 91, and we didn't come out until 96. Crime had already dropped, welfare had already dropped. Let me close by just talking about strong mayors, the importance of strong mayors. What strong mayors do is they allow cities to transcend their parochial interests. In New York, our parochial interests transcended us. They ran the city for their benefit. Part of the difference is the number of homeowners you have. You have many more homeowners as a percentage of your population than New York does. And they're sensitive to taxes. We don't have that in New York, unfortunately. But a strong mayor can resist parochial demands if they're too extreme. He has to be considerate of all the major interests, but he doesn't have to be blackballed into giving up too much. And if you look at those cities that have done badly in recent years, go to Cincinnati or Cleveland or Philadelphia. There are places where strong mayors didn't do this. Philadelphia had a brief run under Rendell and then went back down the tubes. If I look at New York today in terms of strong mayors, it is now more time has passed since 9/11 than it took to fight and defeat the Germans and Japanese in World War II. Nothing has been built at ground zero. Nothing has been built at ground zero. New York is partly reverting to its old form. Mayor Bloomberg will be elected in a landslide because he's got an extraordinarily weak opponent who's not even marginally credible. But Bloomberg is not a strong mayor, and New York will suffer in the long run. So I just hope in about 3 years, when you read the headlines about New York's new fiscal problems, you remember what I talked about today. Thank you.
Let's talk about Giuliani running for president. I think I know the Republican electorate probably better than you do. I think they're Rush Limbaugh listeners. Some of them test for fluoride in the water and think their teeth are falling out. This is a very conservative social constituency. If Giuliani wants to run, how will he, being pro-choice and pro-gay rights, surmount that?
lot depends what the issues are. If the issue of terror and safety are the defining issues, if we have more Katrinas where competence comes to the fore, more London bombings, another bombing in the United States, he will make a very strong run. Before I go into Giuliani I've been traveling around the country flogging my book for 6 months now, so I'll talk about that in a second, but I want to explain something crucial. The calendar is different next time. It used to be you'd go from Iowa to New Hampshire, from New Hampshire to South Carolina. South Carolina is where McCain went down last time. This time you go from New Hampshire to New Jersey, where Giuliani and McCain will both do very, very well. Also, the map may change further. There may be a western primary like there is a southern primary. That said, in traveling around the country in some very conservative territory, there's enormous amount of support for Giuliani. And I think that will increase after the 2006 elections when the Republicans take serious losses. I thought that before Katrina, before Myers, et cetera, et cetera. I think the Republicans are going to take some serious losses. The base strategy has gone as far as it can go. And so guys like Giuliani and McCain, I think, will get a boost. That said, Giuliani will no doubt modify some of his positions. His position on abortion was adopted in 1989 to run for mayor. No other reason. He'll discover between now and 1987 that he's really not in favor of partial birth abortion. And on gay rights, he'll be in favor of civil union the same way Bush was sotto voce in 2004. I don't think this is quite as insurmountable as people suggest. That said, events will define the political landscape, and we'll see how that plays out.
Very good. Questions? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Mike Gonzalez, longtime City Club member. Sir, can you comment on how the mayoral term limits over the long haul have impacted New York?
Not much effect. Not much of an effect. If you're an ambitious mayor, you want to move on. Term limits hasn't had much effect at all. In our city council, you have to understand, our city council races draw between 3 and 7% of the electorate. New York is a very peculiar place. It's both hyper-politicized and depoliticized. Very low rates of voting participation. There are rarely contested offices. There's a contested mayor's race this year, but nothing below mayor is contested, except for a few marginal council seats. What's happened is when people leave office in the lower offices, they're replaced by their cousins or their friends. It's the same people, the same set of interests. On the mayoral level, very few people want to serve more than 8 years. And second terms generally aren't as successful. So I don't think it's had much effect. What's had an effect in New York, which I talk about in the book, and maybe those of you who read it will be grateful that my editor cut 40,000 words, there was a whole chapter on the New York City Charter. What the 1989 New York City Charter did was make the mayor much stronger. And that's part of what allowed Giuliani, that's what I was going over with Giuliani, the powers he had that Dinkins didn't realize he had, and that Bloomberg hasn't used very well. $4 billion makes a guy look far more competent than he really is. But if you look at successful cities around the country, they either have a strong mayor system or they're moving to a strong mayor system. Oakland has moved to a strong mayor system. It's part of the reason why Jerry Brown has been less than moonbeam-like as mayor. It's why Doug Wilder is able to do a good job in Richmond. What happens is as cities decline, as older industrial cities decline, like Cleveland, like Detroit, only the parochial interests are left. Much of the middle class, private sector business leaves. There's no counterweight. There's no counterweight to public sector interests. The only possible counterweight is a mayor who can look beyond narrow interest groups. If you don't have that, you don't have a chance. It's not a guarantee, it's just a prerequisite.
My question is on the levels of political corruption. In the Illinois, we have the specter of the former governor on trial, the current governor being grilled, and the mayor's office having every trusted aide that he has being interviewed by the FBI. Could you contrast or compare that to New York?
In New York, corruption is legal, and what I mean by that is, I don't mean this in the New Orleans sense. Interesting fact about Louisiana and corruption. In the pre-Civil War South, the only state in the Union where bribing a public official was not illegal was Louisiana. It's their French heritage. When I say corruption is legal, I mean that corruption in New York is not technically illegal. The Port Authority is not technically corrupt when it raises fares in order to buy an art collection. No laws have been broken. But is that corrupt? Deeply. New York, on the surface, is a more honest place. Functionally, it's not much more honest than Chicago. Because the public sector is so much larger in New York than it is in Chicago, no one gets in the way of it. Giuliani was the exception. He was willing to stand in front of the bulldozer because he was a bulldozer himself. But by and large, when I look at what city government does, for instance, is it right that public officials running virtually unopposed get 6-to-1 matching monies? Right? Suppose you were to run, the gentleman before asked me the question about term limits. Suppose you were to run for city council in New York, right? Every dollar you raise, you could get $6. Now, suppose you were corrupt, but not in any overt way, and you really didn't want to run for city council, but this is good. You get your relatives to pony up some money, right? And then you get the 6-to-1 matching funds. That's actually happened in New York. It's perfectly legal. Not corrupt, is it? Nothing corrupt about this, but it's deeply corrupt. When you have a system with no accountability, where the average councilman wins with 85 to 90% of the vote, you've got a problem. There is literally no accountability. And so, yes, New York doesn't have the number of corruption investigations you do. We have a different kind of corruption. For instance, I'm usually a critic of the New York Times. Their batting average is so low they wouldn't make the minor leagues in most cases. But one thing they got very right. We spend $50 billion a year on Medicaid, more than California and Texas combined. About 20% of that, $10 billion, is fraudulent. One particular dentist performing 100 procedures an hour. Now, is this technically illegal? No. But because Medicaid operations are so politically important, they're never investigated. The next governor of New York State will probably be Eliot Spitzer. He has a large office dedicated to Medicaid fraud. Somehow he didn't discover this. Somehow any schnook who walks off the street into one of these dental offices, knows it's peculiar. There are 6 people in the office, and then they're being billed for 100. So this was not very far beneath the surface. So New Yorkers can be too smug and self-satisfied. Now, the one place where we probably are more honest is judges. But our judges are often raging ideologues, so we have a different problem.
How could Giuliani make a mistake as he did with the police commissioner, naming him as Homeland Security Director, who...
You mean Bush? How did Bush make that mistake?
Well, Bush made the mistake listening to your friend Giuliani.
No, not what
No. I don't know.
Let me describe what happened.
Okay, first of all, tell the story of Kerik, who was a legend, and on the other hand, he had girlfriends in 3 sections of town and everything else. Go ahead.
Without getting too complicated, Bernie Kerik, if you met him, was a hell of a guy. Everyone likes him. Bernie Kerik, he was the last New York City police commissioner. He was named head of Homeland Security by Bush. It turned out people discovered the underside of Bernie. He had a girlfriend, a well-to-do publisher at Reagan Books. He was shacking up with her during 9/11, on and on. Bernie Kerik was not Giuliani's idea. Bernie Kerik was Bush's idea. Bernie Kerik is an enormously appealing, charming guy who comes out of the demi-monde. I'll come back to that in a second, but I want you to think about something for a second. When Katrina happens, Mike Chertoff, who I know slightly, is head of Homeland Security. Brilliant lawyer, honest, decent, fair, and procedural. He argues with Governor Blanco, the governor of Louisiana, raging incompetent, about reimbursement rates and sovereignty. Bernie Kerik, if he'd been running Homeland Security, wouldn't have talked to her for 10 minutes. He would have said, I'm not putting up with this. Hell with it. We're going in. So it would have been good. It would have been a good thing at Bernie Kerik. Now, what about Kerik's failings? They're real. He becomes police commissioner in the last 2.5 years of the Giuliani administration. He does a good job of reestablishing ties to the black community who have been alienated by some police shootings. But about 6 months into his term, Bernie does something odd. He sends out busts of himself to every precinct house in New York. You knew he was over the top then. He's actually a very competent guy with a second side. He's Janus-faced. When he took over Rikers Island, or a huge prison complex in the East River, there were 300 stabbings a month. After 6 months, there were 8 stabbings a month. After a year, there were 3 stabbings a month. He's very competent. He's also a guy with ties to less than reputable people.
Does Giuliani have a problem with somebody as the former police commissioner getting a lot of attention, and he's sort of jealous of it?
Yes. Yeah. What Tom's referring to is his first police commissioner, Bill Bratton, the guy who really turned the police department around. Giuliani backed him to the hilt. Bratton is now out in L.A., where he's doing a fantastic job. The trouble is that Bratton and Giuliani are really the same person. When they're in the room, they're both type A personalities. They're doppelgangers of each other. They each dominate every room. When Giuliani was handing out David Osborne's Reinventing Government, Bratton was handing out Champy's Re-engineering the Corporation. They're both men of action who are also brilliant. And when you would walk into the room, when I walked into the room with them, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I just wanted to get away. They just sucked all the air out around them. And Giuliani's failure to get along with Bratton, his inability to rise above their petty disputes, speaks poorly of him. And it'll count against him in a presidential run, because the question will be, especially after we look at Harriet Miers, can he gather first-rate people around him? Does he have to dominate the show? His staff were sometimes known as, at the federal attorney's office, were sometimes known as either the Yes Rudies or Rudy and the Rudettes with a double meaning.
Yeah, why don't you go to the mic? The reason we go to the mic is that we have a camera on us. Go ahead.
Paul Karras. Fred, I'd like to go back in history beyond Lindsay. Would you do any revision to Robert Caro's view of Robert Moses?
Robert Caro's book is very close to fiction. I used to assign it, but there were so many mistakes on every page, I couldn't assign it because I ended up spending, well, this is not true and that's not true and he got this wrong. Yeah, Robert Caro wrote a book about Robert Moses, and a lot of what he said about Moses is true. Moses was a son of a bitch. But since Moses, nothing has been built. Nothing has been built. That interest group politics I'm describing to you that eats the city up, that meant when we wanted to build a Westway, when the West Side Highway collapses after Lindsay. Lindsay couldn't spend money on highway maintenance. That was too mundane. That was something for Richard M. Daley to do. When that collapses, we get all this, we have an offer of enormous federal subsidies to build the West Side Highway. We're never able to build it. Once Moses goes, nothing gets done. In other words, if you don't have someone like a Moses or a Giuliani, a son of a bitch, who knows what he's doing, who knows how to make things work, the interest groups in New York simply jam up the wheels. They put sticks in the spokes, nothing happens. But as for Caro's book, the bizarre thing about Caro is he's a very smart guy, a very good writer. There's no economy for Caro. It doesn't exist. Read the book. There is no economy. It's not part of his worldview. He's a moralist. And how many people read Caro's book on Lyndon Johnson, the 3-volume book on Lyndon Johnson? Go back and look at the first volume. And God, the guy's escaping. The governor of Texas that Johnson beats. No, not John Con. Coke Stevenson. In that book, Coke Stevenson wears the white hat. Caro's books are always full of white hats and black hats. Coke Stevenson, he's the good, honest man who the mean son of a bitch, Lyndon Johnson, tore down. Coke Stevenson was a die-hard segregationist, a blatant racist. Doesn't show up in Caro's book. I don't trust anything Caro writes, but I'm a mean guy.
Is Giuliani interested in running for president? And if so, what would you imagine his strategy would be?
He's interested in president much the way the White Sox were interested in winning the World Series. His strategy is, Tom has raised something interesting, a really interesting point. He's got an unusual strategy. He's not campaigning in any sense. He's running his business, and his business is his campaign. He has Giuliani consultancy. All of a sudden, you discover he's partnering deals with people in Texas with ties to the Bush family. He's talking about an alternative league to the National Hockey League. Well, I don't know whether that's a winning proposition, but you have to meet with people in 50 cities to do that. So he's using his business to forge a presidential campaign. I don't think you'll see an overt political campaign until after the midterm elections. And by the way, did no one disagree with anything I said before?
Is he too prickly to be elected in this country? I can understand in New York, but what about this country?
That was unfair. First of all, when people talk about the inevitability in history, this must happen, social forces, the only reason Giuliani was elected in '94, you got to picture this now. City's lost 250,000 jobs. Crime at record levels. We have 2 major riots. Government is gridlocked. Nothing is happening. People want to leave. The only reason he won is because there was, on the ballot was a motion to allow Staten Island to secede. So when people come out in Staten Island in support of secession, that's Giuliani's vote. He wins by the tiniest hair. It's a fluke. And when he wins, people are worried that he's going to do something. The assumption is if he does something, it'll produce more riots. The city was covered in permafrost of pessimism so thick that people didn't want him to do anything. The idea was, just ride it out best you can. This is an ugly word, but it's an accurate one. There was a sense that the underclass had won. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the late great Daniel Patrick Moynihan, wrote an essay called Defining Deviancy Down. And the assumption was that this was the way things were going to be. That if you had a car radio, you had to put a sign on it saying no radio. So essentially saying, I surrender, go steal the next guy's radio. There was a sense that nothing could be done when he took over. That's part of what makes his achievement so extraordinary. He does what he does without any major political allies, with the exception of a guy named Peter Vallone. A wonderful, wonderful guy, honest, decent, a guy who could easily come out of the world of Chicago politics. Deeply rooted in his neighborhood, devout Catholic, down to earth, not ideological in the slightest. He's a crucial ally of Giuliani. Without him, Giuliani couldn't have done nearly as much as he did. Having said that, that's it. Most other people were opposed to him. He intimidated people, and he intimidated people by being smarter than they were. People weren't used to intelligence in government. So when he wanted to merge, New York used to have 3 police departments. It had NYPD, it had the housing cops, and it had transit cops. They were separate. For 30 years, mayors had tried to merge them. Couldn't do it. The unions, their supporters always blocked it. Giuliani figured out, and he had a crack staff around him. You have to understand, Giuliani only slept 3 or 4 hours a day, and he expected his staff to act similarly. He expected them to work around the clock. They figured out that the city was paying an obscure codicil to an ancient contract, that the city was paying for the Transit Authority police. So they said to the Metropolitan Transit Authority, you don't want us to merge? We'll stop paying for the cops. You pay for them. The merger went through. He did that time and again. He figured out where the levers were, where you could force the action.
We still have a little time, and I've got a couple of questions, if you don't mind. Here is a guy who was mayor and is interested in running for president. No one in American history moved right from mayor to running for president. Did he make a mistake in not running for the governorship of New York?
You can only ask that question if you've never been to Albany. Springfield is a paradise compared to Albany. Nelson Rockefeller replaced a beautiful old city. As a preservationist here, you'll know what I'm talking about. A beautiful old Victorian city with cement blocks. It's just hideous. It's a hideous place. Giuliani never wanted to be a senator either. He almost ran for the Senate. I knew he wasn't going to run when on opening day for the Yankees. He was supposed to be in Buffalo at some rubber chicken dinner, and he ended up at Yankee Stadium. It was clear he wasn't. Giuliani is an executive, and yes, he would have made a very good governor, but he didn't want to spend any time in Albany. And did he make a mistake? I don't know. It's not clear why being governor of New York would enhance his position. He left office as a hero. He has an extraordinary record of accomplishment. I'm not sure how much you could burnish that. And Albany is a place, you have to understand something about the New York State Legislature. People are more likely to be murdered than defeated for re-election. The way the districts are defined, not metaphorical. The way the district lines are drawn, again, there's absolutely no accountability. So, no, I don't, personally, I don't like being in Albany. Maybe that's coloring my answer.
And now some questions on the person Giuliani. His first wife was his first cousin. His second wife was an actress who starred in the Vagina.
Second cousin.
Second cousin. The second wife was an actress who starred in the Vagina monologues against his wishes. What do we say about that for who's who?
What about the third?
The third is, I guess, a nice lady.
Oh, no.
No? Okay.
More here. Look, his opponents are going to have a field day with some of the things he did. Every year the press club puts on a drama. One year he comes out as Marilyn Monroe. Imagine what that picture, you know, when he's running in South Carolina, I imagine that picture will be on every poster. Rudy Giuliani in a blonde wig and a dress. I mean, it's perfect. He's left many hostages to fortune. I don't have any question about that. The question will be whether his sense of competence, the sense people have of him is competent, whether that overrides it, whether they want someone who they think can handle national security matters. Let me mention a weakness of his that hasn't been mentioned. It's not usually mentioned around the country. That's immigration. When I was in Arizona, whenever I went south of Phoenix, that's all anyone wanted to talk about was immigration. And people were mad. Giuliani has been very in favor of open immigration. That does not fly. He's going to have to change his position on this, I think, as well. And that's going to hurt him. But as for his personal life, yeah, I think it's going to hurt him. There's no question. But people are going to vote for him because they think he can do certain kinds of things. They think that had he been in charge, Katrina would have been handled better. No doubt true. On the question of entitlements, they'll remember or they'll hear about what he did with welfare reform in New York. And the entitlement problem is not going away. The Medicaid problem that New York faces, we have an acute form of it because the public sector unions in healthcare are so powerful. But the whole country, virtually every state government is running up against it on Medicaid. What Giuliani has to say on this will be of interest, and what he did on welfare reform will count in his behalf. But, you know, having said that, I mean, Dick Morris just came out with a book, Condi versus Hillary. It's 2005. I mean, other than the fact that Dick Morris is obsessed with Hillary Clinton, I can't understand why anyone would write a book on the 2008 presidential election now. What you want to watch for over the years is how does Giuliani subtly shift his positions? And I suspect he will.
And finally, how's his health? He had a serious problem with prostate cancer. That could be a killer. What's the situation on his health?
Just want to go back to the other question. The first marriage lasted for 12 years, at which point he discovered that his wife was his second cousin, and that was the reason for the annulment. This will come in for late night comics will have a lot of fun with this. As for his health, it seems to be good. He seems to have gotten over the problems. If there's a recurrence, obviously it'll cast a shadow. But the next president, let me step outside of the frame here for a second. The next president's going to face an extraordinary set of problems. Europe is literally dying off. The German replacement rate is 2.1 children per family. They produce 1.1 children per family. Italy's the same. France is slightly higher. The world is changing in dramatic ways. The tensions between China and Japan over oil and the Spratly Islands. We're going to enter into a very, very dangerous world in which questions of al-Qaeda, terrorism, the rise of China intersect with each other. I think those are the questions that come to the fore. If they are at the fore, if I'm right, those are the questions that come to the fore between now and 2008. Both Giuliani and McCain will benefit considerably. And just let me mention two dark horses for a second. Mark Warner among the Democrats, who's an enormously impressive guy by all accounts, and Mike Huckabee, the governor Republican governor of Arkansas on the other side.
Thank you very much.